Hello and welcome to this final presentation on ACs 1.2 and 3.1 of Unit 4, where we're looking about the organisation of the criminal justice system in England and Wales. And this final PowerPoint looks at the role of charities and pressure groups. Although they are not a part of the criminal justice system, they are active within it to try and hold it to account, or certainly hold certain elements of it to account. And we're going to look at the work of two charities and pressure groups, which are NACRO and firstly the Howard League for Penal Reform. So, as I've said, although not an official part of the justice system, charities and pressure groups hold the criminal justice system to account. In terms of funding, well, they're not a government-funded organisation, they're non-profit making, so they totally rely on donations to fund their work. And because they're charities, they have certain tax advantages from the government. They pay less tax. And so for purposes of preparing the exam, as I've said, we're going to look at two charities pressure groups, Howard League for Penal Reform and NACRO. So let's start with the Howard League for Penal Reform. Howard League is the oldest prison reform charity in the UK. It was first established in 1866, named after John Howard, one of the first prison reformers. And according to its website, the Howard League stands for the following: less crime, safer communities, fewer people in prison. So the Howard League makes no secret of the fact that it thinks that our current prison system doesn't tackle the underlying causes of crime. It's not fit for purpose. And it uses the following points to justify its views. So the Howard League would say, look at the number of men, women and children that have been sent to prison. It's more than doubled in the last 3 decades. Most people spend less than a year inside. This is a huge cost to the taxpayer, to society, and to communities. And reoffending rates on release creates even more victims of crime, because our reoffending rates aren't good. So while the prison population continues to grow, the money, the resources available to manage that population isn't there. More and more we see prisoners lying on their bunks with little positive to do. And that leads to the problems of prison suicides, rising violence and drug abuse behind bars. And I think if you look over the last, let's say, 20 years, where the prison population has doubled, but the amount of prison officers has stayed relatively the same, if not less, funding is less, they are right. There's little evidence to suggest that they aren't right. More time spent in cells, suicides are on the rise, violence is on the rise, drug abuse is on the rise. The statistics show it. Howard League would say that crime is often caused by drug or drink problems, by poor mental health, by abuse and neglect at an early age. And they would argue that the public need a justice system that tackles these underlying causes of crime and invests in their prevention. So they're sort of saying that our system is shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, and you need to get down to the root causes of crime, deal with those, throw money at that, and then you won't have to throw money in the prison system because you'll have dealt with the problem before it starts. And they would argue you can never imprison your way to a safer society. So the Howard League for Penal Reform and right realists are at complete opposing ends of the spectrum. Howard League would just say prisons just store up and create problems that come back to haunt our communities in the form of more crime and more human misery later on. Make what you will of what they think. I know where I stand on it. So that's what they stand for. What you will need is some case studies for each of these charities and pressure groups to to show what they've done to improve things, to change things within the prison system. And the first case study I would use for the Howard League for Penal Reform is their Books for Prisoners campaign. And this was a campaign set up in 2014 because there were restrictions on sending books to people in prisons in England and Wales. So in November 2013, the Ministry of Justice introduced a new blanket ban on loved ones sending in books and other essentials such as underwear to prisoners. This was this getting tough on crime bit. This was due to a crackdown on what ministers described as prisoners' perks and privileges, though a book is a perk or a privilege? Well, you can see what the Howard League thought about that. So they launched this campaign, Books for Prisoners, in March 2014. In the first week of the campaign, a letter was sent to the Daily Telegraph from many of the country's leading authors. Thousands of Howard League supporters tweeted what they called shelfies to the Ministry of Justice, so pictures of their bookshelves, and the poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy staged a poetry reading, The Ballad of Not Reading in Jail. That's a pun on Oscar Wilde's book, The Ballad of Reading Jail, where he was imprisoned for homosexuality. She read it outside Pentonville in North London. If you click on, no, you can't, I've got the link there, but if, let's see if I can show you what the link is. I don't think it's going to, no. If you Google Books for Prisoners Howard League, you will find a clip which shows Carol Ann Duffy reading that outside Pentonville jail. And as the campaign progressed, authors delivered a letter to the Prime Minister, David Cameron. The Howard League staged a silent protest as the Justice Secretary gave evidence to a parliamentary committee. And Santa visited the Ministry of Justice as part of a Christmas carol. And the High Court, by the end of this, just said, these restrictions are completely unlawful and overturned the government's decision, and therefore prisoners were allowed books. So there, behind me is Santa delivering some presents to the Ministry of Justice. So that's your first case study, successful case study. The next case study we can look at is women's bail hostels. Now this was a campaign, a successful campaign by the Howard League for Penal Reform to raise awareness of the lack of, they were called approved premises, also known as women's bail hostels. Lots of approved premises for men around the country, very few for women. And this created an issue that the Howard League for Penal Reform raised. So in the court case Cole v Secretary of the State for Justice in 2017, the Howard League intervened in that case to provide expert witness about women's experiences of approved premises. And the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, ruled that the distribution of approved premises around the country discriminated against women. So this was a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court, really against the government. So for many people, one of the conditions that you might have for being released on a licence is that you have to live in an approved premises. They're all single-sex establishment. There are 94 approved premises for men located throughout England and Wales, with several in London. However, if you are a woman released on licence and have to live in an approved premises, there are only 6 approved premises in the country. Bedford, which is near to London, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Preston and Reading. So none in London and none in Wales. So that means that if you are a woman that's being released on licence, you're much more likely than men to be placed in approved premises that are far from your homes and families, which therefore means they suffer long-term disadvantage in terms of accommodation, rehabilitation, employment, as well as re-establishing relationships in their community after release. If you were in Devon and a woman being released from prison, your nearest one would be Reading. And Reading is a good 2.5 hour drive up the motorway, if not more, from Plymouth more, 3 hours. So ridiculous. So 132 miles away, as I said. So that one, they won that case and raised the issue. So our other charity that we're going to look at is NACRO, which stands for National Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders. I just call it NACRO and worry about remembering what it stands for. It's a social justice charity based in England and Wales, established in 1966, and it's the largest criminal justice related charity in England and Wales. So I've chosen the Howard League because it's the oldest, and NACRO because it's the largest. Again, we need to go down to some case studies. The one I've used for NACRO, the best one is End Friday Releases. There's a YouTube video for you to watch about their campaign, which has now been successful. So what used to happen was over a third of all releases from prison happened on a Friday, and NACRO got together with also the Howard League for Penal Reform to launch this campaign to end Friday releases from prison, because being released on Friday meant a race against the clock to access services such as accommodation, drug medication, benefits, which shut down on a Friday and don't reopen until the Monday. So if you don't get it sorted by the end of Friday, you've got 2 days without anything. So what that meant was, in reality, that a lot of people were having to sleep rough and survive on their discharge grant, which at the time their campaign was 46 quid, until the services reopened on a Monday. So if you couldn't find anywhere to stay, anywhere to live, and you're only 46 quid, you're struggling a bit, you're sleeping rough, and that leaves you open to reoffending simply to get a roof over your head. So that means that prisoners quickly breach the conditions of their licence and end up being recalled. So that's what the End Friday Release campaign was about. And as I said, if you watch that video, that explains it all. Okay, so back to prison they went, which is not giving people much of a chance. So following consultation with the government, 2021 Prison Strategy White Paper, the Ministry of Justice committed to taking action to reduce Friday releases. So Simon Fell introduced the Offenders' Day of Release from Detention Private Members Bill in the House of Commons, and it became law in June 2023. So basically what this new law, as a result of the campaign to end Friday releases, did was it said prison governments now have the power to release people with high resettlement needs up to 48 hours early to help their resettlement. So this, for example, could be people facing homelessness and in need of accommodation, people who face mental health or substance misuse issues and need to get support in place, people who need to travel a significant distance on leaving prison. The chance to this, so basically, this change allowed people and services to support them the extra time before the weekend to get the support they need in place. So following royal assent, the new Act and the Ministry of Justice will work with prisons to begin implementing those changes. And the second case study I've chosen by NACRO is still ongoing, so it hasn't come to fruition yet, but they're doing it at the moment, and it's called the Call to Connect campaign. I was really surprised when I found this one out, so there's some links there to the Call Connect campaign, gives you their video on it. So this is about phone calls in prison. And NACRO say, look, ensuring that people in prison maintain relationships with their friends and families leads to better mental health and well-being, but also better rehabilitation. You're 39% less likely to reoffend if you keep your family connections going during your time in prison. Visits aren't always possible, especially at times such as Christmas. So for most people in prison, phone calls are the main way they stay connected to their family. This is a bit that then surprised me. Phone calls are more expensive in prison than they are in the outside world, and people in prison are paid very little, often as low as £10 a week or less. So what this means is many people in prison just can't afford to call their friends, family and loved ones regularly because the cost of the phone calls are so high. So they founded something called the Justice Exchange, which is a forum of NACRO service users who've been in contact with the justice system, and they're highlighting this issue as something they struggle with and see others in prison struggle with, especially over key holidays such as Christmas. So basically, they're calling for changes so people in prison can keep connections with their loved ones. So they say, right, what we need is cheaper call pricing. which takes into account how little people in prison are paid, often as £10 a week. So if anything, you don't want more expensive phone calls to prisoners, you want less expensive. Be more, reflect what people pay on the outside. I mean, most of us have either got free anytime calls on our mobiles or our landlines free as well. So God knows why people have to pay for it in prison, but there you go. So they make this point: mobile and landline calls to be priced the same, like they usually are on the outside. In prison, calls to mobiles are on average twice as expensive as calls to landline. Bonkers. And they say there should be free calls during key holiday times such as Christmas and other religious festivals. So that's what the campaign is about. And we shall wait and see how successful that is. So, to sum up, charities are a really important part of the criminal justice system because they complement the various government agencies and help bring about social control. They're supporting offenders with housing, welfare benefits, they're offering practical support. That helps prevent reoffending and so brings about social control. There are charities that support those in prison by campaigning to improve prison conditions and social control within prison, so that's a good thing. Other charities also, or alternatively, support the families of offenders, which improves the home environment on release, making people less likely to offend, reoffend, better social control therefore. However, charities are limited by their financial resources. Because they're funded through voluntary donations and membership subscriptions, they've got to persuade people to donate so that they can provide support within the criminal justice system. So their income's not guaranteed, and this therefore could impact on their effectiveness. And the reality is, they're all competing for work within the criminal justice system, so they're competing with each other for support. So NACRA are competing with the Howard League for Penal Reform to get the money that's out there. And of course, lots of people aren't happy to give to prison reform charities. They'd rather give to animal welfare, cancer research, that sort of thing. So there's a limited amount of money out there. And then the other thing, even though I say they hold the government to account, they can't force the government to take notice of them. All they can do, they can't force them to act upon or implement their proposals. All they can do is apply pressure, hence pressure groups. But I've given you some case studies where they have been effective and it has worked. So on to our final slide. This slide here, I would use if you get a question on evaluate the effectiveness of charities in achieving social control. So you can look at some of the good points, some of the bad points, okay, and use the case studies as well. So on to the last slide, which is about links with others within the criminal system. And really there's just two here. Prison and Probation Service, well, they'll work with the Prison and Probation Service to ensure prisoners' rights are being upheld. And also they might apply pressure on the courts through their campaigns to reduce the amount of custodial sentences that are being imposed. So those are really who they work with. It's mainly prisons and probation service, and perhaps a bit of pressure on the courts to reduce those custodial sentences. Hope you found that all informative, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Take care, have a good day.